Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event. My name is Chris Coulter, and I'm the Executive Director of the Burgle Foundation. This event today is on how climate finance can reach what we call fragile and conflict-affected countries. It comes right as we are also releasing our new report, which is called Entry Points for Climate Finance and Peacebuilding in Afghanistan. I would like to start by thanking the author of the report, who is with us today, Dima Reda, but also a big thank you to our senior climate advisor, Nazanin Moshiri, who's also moderating today's event, and of course our Afghanistan team here at Berghof, who are continuously working on this topic. And also here today with us are our esteemed panelists, Mauricio Vasquez and Charity Watson, and I hope Dr. Faiz Zaland. But before we hear from them, I would like to share some thoughts. As we know, COP30 ended last week, a bit dramatically. But for us, there was a critical blind spot on the agenda: peace. Because when you look at the reality on the ground in countries like Afghanistan, Sudan, or Somalia, where climate and conflict risks collide, it's obvious that the link between peacebuilding and climate cannot be overlooked. Across our projects in Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, and others, we see when climate efforts are conflict sensitive, they not only strengthen resilience, they actually also strengthen peace. But major challenges remain, of course. Climate finance is still not reaching the communities that need it most. Over 1 billion people live in countries affected by conflict and fragility, and many of them are also facing the world's most severe climate impacts. These contexts receive only a fraction of the global climate finance. And this is a missed opportunity. In fragile settings, investments in water systems, land restoration, disaster preparedness can also help reduce tensions, support social cohesion, create space for constructive dialogue. So while the global climate finance system is beginning to adjust to address to fragile context, we still feel that this is not happening fast enough. At today's event, we will discuss some of the recommendations of our recently published report. The report, which is well worth reading, offers a systematic analysis of climate finance flows to conflict-affected countries, and it uses Afghanistan as a case study. For me, the conclusions of this report send a clear message. Closing the climate finance gap is vital, not only for meeting global climate ambitions, but indeed for building sustainable peace. And that means ensuring that the people most exposed to climate fragility are not left behind. With that, welcome, and over to you, Nazanin.
Thank you so much. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you so much, Chris. Really excited to be hosting this event. A big welcome to our audience, wherever you are in the world right now. And look, as Chris mentioned, this discussion and the report couldn't be more timely. I just got back from COP30 in Belém. And yes, you know, we had a great announcement there about adaptation finance being recognized, even being tripled. Yet there's still no roadmap for delivery. And we're going to talk a little bit about that a bit later on with our panelists. But, you know, many countries, including Afghanistan, sort of remain in this gap between acknowledgement that they're not getting enough climate finance and actual action. And I'm really excited to bring in our panelists today. We've got Dima Redder, who is, of course, the author of our report, the founder of Nataj Group, which helps countries access climate finance under the UNFCCC. She has more than 20 years' experience in international development and global climate finance mechanisms. Also joining us from Kabul is Dr. Fayez Mohammad Zarland, who's a PhD scholar, research analyst, and professor at the University of Kabul. He focuses on international relations, geopolitics, policy making. He's working on developing concrete approaches for local governance, climate change, of course, which is relevant to today, public sector reform, and peace building, among many other things. Also, really excited that Charity Watson is joining us. She is the UN's Climate, Peace and Security Advisor for the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. She spent the last 10 years working in Afghanistan across politics, security, humanitarian sector, environmental issues with the UN, NGOs, and research institutes. And last but not least, Mauricio Vasquez, who is the head of policy at ODI's Global Risks and Resilience Program. His work focuses on advancing climate action in fragile and conflict-affected situations in a way that addresses both climate risks and the drivers of conflict and fragility. And we'll be coming to them in a minute. So look, the audience, you out there, you can ask questions. We have a question and answer function here in Zoom, and hopefully we'll get to you soon. We're also recording this. So say if you have to leave for any reason, we will have a recording. We will be posting it. But first, I'd like to hand over to Dima, the author of our report, who's going to take us through the report, some of the key recommendations and findings. Over to you, Dima.
Thank you so much. I am sharing my screen with a few slides because I'll be running through some key points for the of the report. I want to thank everyone who's attending this panel, and thank you to Berghoff for putting on the panel and commissioning this the report itself, and bringing it kind of to fruition. I have been working with the climate vertical funds for close to 20 years now, and both inside the funds and also outside trying to help countries access climate finance. And it is difficult to access these funds under the best of circumstances. So then when we throw in some of these challenges on the ground, it becomes even more difficult. The reality is there just is not enough finance for what we need in this to tackle the climate challenges. And I think as Chris eloquently mentioned, that nexus between peace and climate is hasn't fully been explored and is an opportunity that we can push as a global community to get more finance to those who need it most. So I'll just dive right in. The overall objective of this report that we have is to better understand the climate finance context for Afghanistan before and after 2021, how that context compares to other similar countries, and then to identify some key opportunities and entry points. There were 4 activities that we undertook. The first was a comparative assessment of the vertical funds and their climate finance, as well as multilateral development banks and those flows into Afghanistan. We looked at 3 countries to do a deeper dive into their finance flows, did some key informant interviews, and had a landscape assessment for international actors in Afghanistan. I will not touch on that in this talk, and that's in chapter 6 if you're interested in looking at that in more detail. So in terms of the vertically integrated climate funds, we're talking about 4 major funds: the Adaptation Fund, the Climate Investment Funds, the Green Climate Fund, and the Global Environment Facility. Between 2014 and 2024, Afghanistan received 15 projects totaling over 56 million US dollars in committed financing from these vertical funds. And these figures place Afghanistan at the lower end of the conflict-affected cohort, ranking it only ahead of Yemen and Syria in terms of total funding. So this is just the table that shows that. You'll see Afghanistan had the most projects from the Global Environmental Facility, the GEF, at close to 40 million US dollars in that period. And then if we look at the average funding between 2014 and 2020 versus 2021 to 2024, most countries in the comparison cohort experienced a rise in average annual funding between 2021 and 2024, whereas Afghanistan saw a decline during this period. And this does reflect the impact of the shifting donor priorities and challenges, as well as international sanctions against Afghanistan. When we look at the MDBs, however, they reported a total of $1.2 billion in climate finance flows to Afghanistan between 2015 and 2023. The average climate finance during this period was 228 million US dollars, with a notable increase actually from 2021 onwards. So the pre-2021 period saw an average of flows of 162 million US dollars, while post-2021 increased to 337 million. The peak was actually in 2021, where it reached 485 million, likely reflecting the emergency adaptation financing that flowed during that political transition. However, they have dropped significantly, sharply in 2023 to 111 million, which might signal some of the challenges that the MDBs are facing in not being able to channel funding directly through the government systems. So looking specifically at the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank, since August 2021, both of those banks do not channel funding directly through the government and instead work exclusively through agencies and/or NGOs as their implementing partners. So the donor hesitancy really remains a key barrier to being able to channel this funding. A lot of donor governments remain cautious about inadvertently legitimizing the Taliban. But even with some of the workarounds that the Asian Development Bank and World Bank are doing, channeling funding through these other implementing entities, the challenges do remain. Not being able to engage directly with Afghan institutions does raise concerns about long-term sustainability, as UN agencies and NGOs kind of operate on a shorter-term project cycle. It limits the ability to establish lasting governance structures. Also, accessing technical expertise. Many former government officials may have fled the country, may be unable to work, or are still within the ministries. So we're losing out on that expertise as well. Another multilateral development bank that we looked at was the Islamic Development Bank. And they have set up an Afghanistan Humanitarian Trust Fund, which is a multi-donor trust fund that's structured as a contractual agreement between ISDB as the trustee and donors. And it does aim to mobilize financial resources in a pooled setting and provide humanitarian assistance. In this trust fund, there is a window for climate projects. I've just put up one here. There are a few more in the report. But this one is on climate resilience and sustainable water supply services in remote rural communities. So the implementing partner is UNICEF, so that money is being channeled through UNICEF to contribute to increased access to safe and sustainable water for underserved communities in rural Afghanistan through climate resilient and sustainable water systems. The overall project is 4 million US dollars, with $1 million from the Saudi Fund for Development, $1 million from the Kuwait Society for Relief, and 2 million in UNICEF matching funds. So this is an alternative funding stream that is not part of this, not part of the mainstream multi-development banks, and also not part of these vertical funds that is active on the ground. Now, just quickly, we have these three comparison country spotlights: Haiti, Somalia, and the DRC. I won't go into too much detail of these, but it kind of highlights the funding that has gone to these countries that have conflict and disaster risk associated with in the near term. So in Haiti, from 2014 to 2024, there have been 28 VIF projects totaling 155 million US dollars in financing. It is important to highlight that following the conflict and following the major earthquake disaster, that funding actually increased. Some of it was due to a lag in the pipeline of the projects, but also some of it was in direct response to the earthquake itself. In Somalia, between the same time period, there have been 12 projects totaling 180 million in VIF grant funding. And one of the important things to note here is if you look, the portfolio has grown over time with almost nothing in 2018 all the way to 100 million in 2024. And I believe that we may have some government officials from Somalia in this Zoom. It would be interesting to hear their perspective, but there's been a lot of work done in Somalia to increase that funding. In the DRC, there have been 33 total projects in this time frame, totaling 240 million US dollars. And a number of these projects should be noted that they were regional programs that the DRC was a part of. So part of that funding was through these regional projects. So in terms of what we can take away from these countries, and again, I'm going through this fairly quickly, but with Somalia, there was exerted effort to have strategic donor coordination, to engage with select ministries that were given targeted capacity building to develop their pipeline. They were also involved in a lot of global dialogues that helped to highlight their need. Within the DRC, a lot of the intermediary structures, so using UN agencies, international NGOs, has really helped to sustain project implementation, even with governance volatility. And then Haiti sort of provides this example of the importance of continuity and adaptability during periods of crisis. So the cases sort of show how appropriate risk management, using flexible implementation models, and so an emphasis on sort of locally grounded partnerships, unique partnerships with international actors can maintain and even increase climate programming in constrained environments. So potential next steps and entry points, and we will discuss more of this too as well with the other panel members and in our Q&A. But one is to engage climate funds on flexible approaches. So maybe not directly sending money to the government, but having other avenues for channeling finance. Expanding participation in global climate dialogue. So being able to bring Afghanistan to the table to at least be a participant in these dialogues is an important initial step. Leveraging intermediary implementation models and replicating other operational models. So this is already being done in Afghanistan and can be done even more so. But also having that discussion with the Green Climate Fund, with the Global Environment Facility as to how that can be done outside of their mainstream models. With the JEF and the GCF and the Adaptation Fund, all of them are looking at new strategies for dealing with for trying to get more finance to fragile in fragile contexts. So as a global community, being able to have input on that process and what that might look like is also highly relevant at this time that they're looking to expand that and have a real strategy. Focusing on community-based entry points. So when we're talking about climate change adaptation, increasing water supplies, looking at drought incidents, a lot of that is really localized and affects smaller communities at a very basic level. So being able to get finance to those communities and those who are most vulnerable, not just within fragile conflict affected states, but all over, is actually a big challenge, and is in some ways this can be an opportunity to strengthen those communities as they try to adapt to the changing climate. And then, of course, the biggest problem is we don't have enough finance. So broadening that climate finance landscape beyond these vertical funds, looking at what the Islamic Development Bank is doing with some of the funders in that region, looking at the diaspora of professionals from Afghanistan who can contribute as well. And thinking through maybe some other philanthropy or private sector that might be interested in engaging in getting climate finance there. So I will end there. Manny, thank you. Thanks for your attention. And I think I'll send it back to Berghoff to
Thank you.
for the next steps.
Thank
you.
Thanks, Dima. Thanks for that great presentation. So I'm going to go straight to our panelists now. Just first of all, if we could go to Dr. Faiz Aland. Can you hear me?
Yes, please. I can hear you.
Brilliant. So, Dr. Zaland, you're a professor there in Kabul. We just want to get a perspective from you on the ground in Afghanistan right now. Obviously, we've come out with this report, which has a lot of the sort of issues that Afghanistan's facing in terms of receiving climate finance since 2021. Can you just give us your sort of reaction to this report and maybe some of the realities right now on the ground there in Kabul and in Afghanistan and the kind of impacts that you're seeing there?
Thank you so much, Nazanin. Thanks to Berghoff for having me. Afghanistan, unfortunately, is one of the most affected country. I think one in the 10 most affected countries around the globe by the climate changes. The winters are harsher and the summers are harsher with the flood and earthquakes. For the ever first time in our past 5 decades, the more earthquakes happened to Afghanistan or in the past 4 years. We are just suffering from earthquake in eastern Afghanistan and also in northern Afghanistan. We were having a very worse earthquake last year in western of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan in all east, west, and center and southeast has been affected by earthquakes, which is one of the result of the harshest climate change. I think the report is highly important and very timely, very important time. The report has come out. It really pinpoints the real problems on the ground here in Afghanistan. And then it provides us a contextual comparison with countries like Somalia, Haiti, and the DRC, which is also affected in almost a similar way as Afghanistan has been affected. So the report highly points out the very most important differences in approaching the problem of climate change in Afghanistan. The climate change, regardless of any gender, it affects everybody around the country, specifically the critical dimension which the report outlines is the impact on women and kids in Afghanistan. As you know, with the gender restriction imposed by the Taliban, it further complicates efforts to ensure equitable access to climate resilience initiatives. So the report really pinpoints how climate is worsening the life of ordinary Afghan women and also kids, which has already been having exclusive rights in many ways in education, private sector, political, and then economic sector. They are limited. With the climate problems and with the effect from the climate, their problems are getting worse and their life is getting worse. So the report also provide us a very good recommendations on innovative financing, which concludes with the most important contextual comparison. The cases demonstrate with appropriate risk management, flexible implementation modalities, and strong emphasis on local ground partnership. Intentional actors can maintain climate program even in constrained environments. So the report really provides context of Afghanistan in comparison with others. So it says that for Afghanistan, they offer practical models of engagement that navigate political sensitivities and still advancing resilience objectives, particularly through trusted intermediaries, community-based structures, and phased institutional support. As Dima very rightly pointed at the potential next steps and entry points, I think we can find very strong and potential partners locally. The most important is the Kabul University Faculty of Environmental Sciences. We have lecturers, master, PhD holders still in the country. We have a master program where students are learning about advanced environmental science knowledge. And we have NEPA, which is the National Authority for Environmental Protection, and many experts from the previous government, from the Republic time, they are still working. I know two of the directors, they are working for past 12 years in NEPA, and they are still continuing. They haven't left their country and their job. And we were together in Indonesia. They were trying to be in Brazil, but they were not allowed previously in Baku in Azerbaijan. So if you have entry point, I think we can find local partners. We can do mass education of people ordinary. We can find universities to do more research-based approach and research on the climate difficulties and problems and effects of Afghanistan on the faculty and research level. And also we have this National Authority Agency, which is non-political, which is working very competitively on different approaches. They have created recently, they have revised their national plan for 2025 to 2035 for 10 years. They divided that into two parts, 5 years. They have shared the report with me. I can share that later on with Nazanin. So they are trying to depoliticize, they are trying to be more inclusive, they are trying to be more practical, and they are trying to be more resilient to cooperate not only the regional actors but the international actors also for overcoming the problems of the climate change in the country.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zarland. Charity, I know you have a very difficult job being the Climate Peace and Security Advisor to the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. We heard there from Dr. Zarland, there is a lot of capacity on the ground, but obviously the problem is money, finance. There's so little of it around. We're all being asked to do so much more with the little that we're getting. And obviously, you know, we're not going to go into the details of why Afghanistan is unable to get any climate financing. I think we all know that. But what is the UN doing about this? What are you doing to try to overcome some of these issues?
Sure. Thanks, Nazanin, and a big congratulations to Berghoff as well as to Dima for a really excellent report. I'd first like to just reiterate what Dr. Zalan noted. It's communities that are bearing the brunt of these climate shocks. And it's not just a future phenomenon, it is unfolding now and increasingly striking at the very foundations of people's lives, their access to basic water, their livelihoods, their food security. And it's really quite critical for the Afghan people as a whole. Looking at the report, I want to reiterate that the report actually shows that the majority of financing for climate action in Afghanistan has come from bilateral and multilateral donors. This is still very much so still the case. A lot of people will say, but there's no climate financing at all for Afghanistan. In fact, the EU did a study from August 2021 to the end of 2023, trying to say how much financing actually is coming in that's contributing to climate resilience. And they found that around $543 million in programming was coming towards fully focused climate resilience activities since 2021. And an additional almost $1 billion was coming towards activities that were partially focused on this. Now, what does that include? It's resilient infrastructure at a community level, climate smart water, agricultural projects, resilient natural capital such as reforestation efforts or rangeland protection. And most of this is already being channeled through UN agencies, through NGOs that are working directly with communities on the ground. But I will admit that this programming is fragmented, with limited coordination mechanisms, and where the role of the de facto authorities is minimized, particularly in an effort to decrease the benefit to the DFA. But why is this also problematic? Because it can lead to fragmented and incoherent approaches and even maladaptation. And climate finance fundamentally needs to be driven by national plans. And this is something that Dr. Zalan just noted, that NEPA and other institutions are working on updating some of these national plans. So it's not up to individual donors, individual NGOs or UN agencies to be defining what climate resilience means for Afghanistan. It's up to, nationally sound or technically sound national plans. And this is something that we are actually actively working on right now, is discussing with both the de facto authorities and international partners, how can we improve coordination? How can we improve coherence? And how can, to the extent feasible, can we do this alongside the de facto authorities? The second thing, though, that I want to touch on is that we have a real problem with the vertical funds. First, in terms of the amounts, and this is also something that came out in the report, because it shows that financing from vertical funds, even before the Taliban took over, was incredibly low, and it's still low. Sometimes you'll see in the news there's $800 million in suspended climate finance, for Afghanistan. Actually, most of the stalled projects were pipeline projects. So when we did an analysis, we really dug in to say what's happening here. So the ongoing projects when the Taliban took over amounted to only $43 million. And that was mostly through Jeff. But the pipeline projects amounted to almost $750 million, mostly through GCF. So we had the low financing before. Now we have a number of suspended, efforts. And I see a big problem in that it looks really, really bad to have one of the most vulnerable countries in the world have limited to no access to these funds. So what have we done in terms of the UN and UNAMA in particular is we've been trying to engage directly with the funds. We've written them formal letters. We've engaged with their secretariats, their board members, clarifying that programming is feasible in the country, off budget, through UN or NGO partners, and requesting them to resume this access to financing to Afghanistan. We have had some successes, particularly through the resumption of some Jeff projects. But when it comes to Adaptation Fund or GCF, not so much. And I think, maybe why is this? That could be a whole different discussion. But I think part of the problem is that these funds are headquartered very far from Afghanistan, and where they're focusing on global portfolios where Afghanistan just isn't high on the agenda. But the second is that their internal procedures are simply complicated by non-recognition and the absence of a UNFCCC focal point for Afghanistan. So it's not necessarily a decision they're making to suspend funds, but just a question of how do we do this when procedurally it's challenging for us. Now, maybe to kind of conclude a little bit, what are some potential solutions, especially for these vertical funds and what we've come to through this engagement over the last few years? I think either globally, the funds need to look procedurally at how do they create pathways for countries like Afghanistan, whose governments are not recognized, to channel finance to the people of those countries that do deserve it and need it. Secondly, though, for Afghanistan, I think we can look at the political process on Afghanistan and say, how can we figure out a way that allows the procedural appointment of technical, nationally designated authorities from Afghanistan that can engage with these funds and help the finance flow to the country. It's not without precedent. The independent assessment on Afghanistan, mandated under UN Security Council Resolution 2679 and supported under Resolution 2721, calls specifically for greater engagement, including technical assistance on climate adaptation, water management, environmental security, and transboundary resource management. So there is sort of a space to have a discussion about how could there be the technical appointment of UNFCCC focal points that would then allow NDAs for the country and help to allow that finance to flow. Not on budget, I don't think anyone is talking about that now, but at least to those organizations that can implement it. But finally, just my last point though, is that if we want real resilience in Afghanistan, current international financing is never going to be enough, especially as it's decreasing. We need to bring the issue of national development financing, of private sector to the table and talk about how can we use collective engagement to have a more comprehensive approach and complementarity between these bilateral, multilateral donors, the vertical funds, the national development budget, and the private sector. So I'll end there, but thank you very much for having me today.
Thanks so much, Charity. I'm sure we'll come back to you with some questions. We're already getting a lot of questions in the Q&A. Again, if you do have any questions, there is an option there for you to put in your questions, and we'll come to you in a bit. But before that, I'd love to go over to Maurizio. I hope you're still there. Maurizio and I were both in Belém, COP30. And Maurizio, you're listening to all of this. I know that you have been focusing on this for many, many years now. And what I'd really like to get from you is just some examples and lessons from the work that you've been doing with other countries which are experiencing fragility or conflict, including Yemen, Somalia, etc. And just your thoughts on COP30 as well. We were both there. I'm a bit disappointed. I'm still mulling over the agreement there. A bit disappointed. I feel like there's still no accountability. Yes, the tripling of adaptation money. So just some thoughts from you on the work you've been doing, some other context, lessons, and COP32. Over to you.
Thank you, Nazani. I cannot agree more with Dr. Salam and Charity as well. But, okay, to my question, two things. So what COP tell us about the state of climate finance for fragile and conflict-affected states or situations, and what lessons we can and cannot take, for example, from countries like Yemen, as is one of the highlights on the report. So let's start with COP30. So what we saw in Belém was a troubling paradox. The impacts of climate change are intensifying, but the politics of finance are retreating. Several major donors are stepping back from the commitments they once showcased as climate leadership. And this widening gap between rhetoric, resources, and responsibility is not abstract. Chris said at the beginning, Nazani, you said, everyone is saying it, in Dr. Salam and Charity as well. The impacts of shrinking aids are making this even more acute, especially for the countries with protracted humanitarian needs, because they depend on vertical climate funds and bilateral ODA for climate-related actions, because they cannot access loans or other instruments. This going back to something that Charity was saying, because sometimes it's not climate finance as per se, but bilateral donor fund programs, and then they tag it in their accounting as climate finance. So when the EU does an assessment on others, you see 500 million here for bilateral aid, etc. And that becomes a bit invisible because sometimes those funds are not actually addressing climate risk. But now that we are in this situation that those very resources are now being squeezed, when you have pledges for the Green Climate Fund that they remain undelivered or have been cut out, as the case of the US, or the case of the UK, where climate finance targets are basically met through creative accounting, and others like Germany that announced the reduction of their international climate finance as well. For the country that relies on those streams, the outlook is bleak. So what COP30 did for them or offered them, in through, not enough. I would say nothing. So yes, there is new language calling for tripling adaptation finance by 2035, as you say, Nazani, but we are far off track at the moment, even for the most modest target or in Glasgow in COP26, the Glasgow commitment to doubling adaptation by 2025. If we cannot achieve that, how we are going to triple it in 10 years if we actually are reducing the commitments? Then we have the issue of the global goal on adaptation. We have a lot of discussions on indicators. We have a set of indicators, but indicators without financing are symbolic. And crucially, COP30 avoided the hard questions of how do we reach people living in conflict-affected areas, how we support displaced populations, refugees, or people in territories under non-state control areas. These difficult places are exactly where the climate impacts are more destructive, and yet they remain largely invisible in the formal architecture of climate finance. Then let's bring me a bit on the discussions about what models we can learn from different countries. And I think that I would like to reflect on Yemen, just because it's in one of the recommendations, there is a spotlight of, okay, can we replicate the Yemeni model to Afghanistan? And I have to actually acknowledge, and also because I know that Liban will speak about Somalia later on, but just to disclose, much of our work has focused on supporting the internationally recognized government and in Yemen. And Yemen, in this sense, has, to its credit, been making real efforts to build credible climate plans. At COP30, they launched their vision and strategy for the next NDCs. They are developing the National Adaptation Plan. They're preparing a readiness proposal for the Green Climate Funds to strengthen the institutional frameworks, but also to build a project of pipelines of programs. So politically and technically, Yemen is doing the groundwork expected for a country seeking to access climate finance. And then what we have is a bit of the experience of what we call the Yemeni model, which was coming out of the initial of the conflict, and has evolved quite a lot. So when we talk about the Yemeni model, we need to actually nuance it a bit, as it is not a single needed package of a package fund model that can be replicated elsewhere. The reality is a bit more complex than that. So basically what we usually talk about the Yemen model or the Yemen fund refers to a World Bank managed multi-trust donor fund that it has been useful but works through parastatal bodies like the Social Fund for Development, because the bank has rules that prohibit direct financing of governments that are in active conflict. Meanwhile, you have the bilateral donors that are funding the government entities in the south and their coordination bodies, and set up a lot of coordination bodies actually. So you have the Yemen Partners Technical Team, the Yemen Partners Group, that they were created as no single mechanism can cover for the entire spectrum of needs, as Dr. Salam was mentioning before. So the implications is that a solution for Afghanistan is simply to found the UN. That's misleading and potentially dangerous. Even Charity refers to that, because it sidelines local formal and informal institutions, it ignores political realities, and it overlooks major blind spots. Especially when we talk about the north of Yemen, that is where most of our, where we know little, especially me. And these are the areas that the UN access is limited and at best where the key national institutions like the Social Fund face political pressures. Even the Ministry of Environment in the North was recently absorbed into another ministry, a reminder that the political economy of climate action cannot be separated from the broader conflict analysis. The lesson from Yemen is not that a single fund can fix climate finance in conflict settings or fragile settings. The lesson is that you need a mix of instruments, pool funds, parastatal implementers, and bilateral channels guided by strong coordination and an honest understanding of the political constraint. So let me close with one point, because any proposed model must be grounded in the realities of governance, access, and institutional capacity, and we cannot afford solutions that look good in paper but fail in practice. Thank you.
Maurizio, thank you so much, and thank you for bringing in that great example from Yemen. So I'm going to go to our Q&A now, but before we do, we have Libsan Obsier, who is from Somalia's National Climate Fund. Liban, could you tell us a little bit about Somalia's example?
Salud.
Leba, go ahead. While Nazanin is recuperating.
So I'm muting myself. So in this day of working from your mobile, your laptop, you have to become an IT expert too. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you for the report. Good evening from Mogadishu. Great to listen to the three speakers before me, and all very insightful discussions and wonderful presentation of the report. I have to say that I've worked very closely with Maurizio, and I know Nazanin very well. We met in COP as well, both very passionate advocates for accessing climate finance in fragile countries. So we're very grateful to them in their professional capacity and their personal passion and commitment. I think I haven't read the report, but I'm very glad it's more literature is coming on board regarding climate fragility and climate finance access. It's very difficult on the ground. I mean, I lead the Somali National Climate Fund. It's actually a facility to ensure we have better coordination, collaboration, and strategic investment planning for climate financing, what little we're getting. And it was a way to respond to many challenges we had. I mean, Somalia has been going through a very difficult debt relief process for the last decade. And once we came out of debt relief, we realized debt relief did not immediately lead to enormous fiscal space, the kind that would allow us to respond adequately to many of our economic challenges and public service financing challenges, including what I would now call responding to climate change. Sadly, the reality is for Somalia now, responding to climate change is actually a public expenditure when it ought to not be, because Somalia is among the least contributors of greenhouse gases. So what would make me happy to see in this report once I read it, hopefully tomorrow or the day after, whenever it's released, I would like the report to actually show the effort of fragile countries in fighting to access climate finance. The fight to access climate finance in Somalia from GCF, the 100 million that was given to Somalia after the head of GCF visited Mafalda, did not come just as a result of generosity. It came as a result of heavy lobbying, starting from the decision point of the HIPC process to the completion point, where it was said that Somalia must see climate financing as a macroeconomic stability issue. And we fought very hard to get that into the international financial institutions narrative. We actually were supported heavily by the ODI and many other friends, and we are grateful to them. I think that early realization that it's part of the wider macroeconomic stability of Somalia as a fragile post-conflict country, it was fundamental to getting that money. Also, we had a champion. Although all the board members of GCF were great, the British government really gave us a big hand up and really made a case for us at the board. And this was supported by most of the board. And it was very well. The argument for Somalia receiving climate financing was actually accepted. I think when you look at plus the diaspora network across the countries where the board members were based was also very powerful. I think the ODI wrote a report on climate finance access in Somalia, which was very consultative and actually was presented and continues to be presented within the Somali government service. And I think that research, I hope, is taken account of in this report. The other thing that will make me happy to see in the report is that Somalia's NDC, National Adaptation Plan, are anchored in the National Transformation Plan. So no longer are we going from project to project. We are now seeking to have a programmatic approach with long-term resilience as the goal. And we think this is important because we need to get out of that aid mentality whereby we think we'll find a bit of money to cover this part of our problem and then later on it returns. We're thinking our resilience and long-term financing. Alongside this, there's the insurance law in Somalia has been passed, the Triple P law has been pushed, and we're using what I would say we're putting our best foot forward despite being still remaining fragile. We're getting our legal and institutional arrangements in order. We're improving macroeconomic stability. We're improving public financial management systems. We're actually, to date, we've absorbed nearly $4 billion of World Bank financing if you include closed projects. So, and the IMF, the IMF follow-on program from the HIPC completion point is actually going very, very well, with Somalia being reviewed every 3 months, and actually our systems proving to be resilient and continuously improving. So this leads me to direct accredited entities. We need climate financing on budget. If it's on budget, we manage it, it's cheaper, we can reach the communities more quickly. I mean, at the moment, we're grateful to our partners within the UN. They really support us. Most of them are the accredited entities at the moment, and some are NGOs, but the cost of doing business is very high. And
thanks so much, Liban. Yeah, just a few more seconds, please. Yeah,
just one more second. The cost of doing business is very high, so we need to get accredited entities in these countries so that we continue to build capacity. And equally as important, what we need to do is we need to ensure that we're helping these countries actually find strategic ways of engaging with GCF, Jeff Adaptation Fund, and all the IFIs to say collective programming for resilience rather than just dealing with them individually. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Liban, and sorry for my coughing fit. I think I'm still recovering from my trip back from Brazil. We've got some really great questions. We haven't got time for all of them, but one really interesting question on Afghanistan, specifically from Graham Smith, I think my former colleague at International Crisis Group. If donors are retreating, what opportunities might exist for private sector engagement to help with climate adaptation in Afghanistan and similar settings? If we can have a quick answer from Dima on that.
Sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, that is a really good question. I think that that there is there are some philanthropies that are, oh wait, yeah, I'm unmuted, sorry. There are some philanthropies that are private sector oriented, that are looking at natural resources that could potentially be tapped into and unlocked. But also local, at the local level, some traders, cooperatives, local service providers, we can think of private sector as being more than just large multinationals, where they can engage in small scale climate relevant initiatives that lead to direct livelihood benefits as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dima. We've got this question also from Maribel Hernandez. Which approaches or mechanisms would you recommend to channel climate finance to where it is most needed when government channels cannot be used? Really interesting question. Maybe to you, Dima, and maybe if anyone else wants to come in there, maybe Maurizio.
Sure. Just quickly, I think that what we've been talking about is trying to channel, especially for climate change adaptation, like we were saying, that where it's the local communities that are most affected, that if we're able to channel that money into the like local cooperatives or women's groups who are working on bolstering their livelihoods or changing their agricultural practices to meet the increased droughts, that those can be really effective. And some of the global funds, like the Adaptation Fund, have a window for locally based adaptation where they're trying to channel money to local actors. There's also like enhanced direct access that the GCF uses, where you have a grant mechanism and then the local actors can tap into that. So I'll stop there. Mauricio, if you have anything to add.
Well, it's a blend of approaches. So we need to try to do as many as possible. But the vertical climate funds are also changing their way of working, and some upcoming type of formalities or mechanisms, especially with the Green Climate Fund, might allow to implement programs without working with the national designated authorities or under specific frameworks or policies. That hasn't been, I believe, yet trial, but something that it might come in the future as well to look and to follow up. But also something as well is that we need to grab the reality that the de facto government is the government in some cases, and that political thing is that if we don't build those capacities and we start working with them at the subnational level, at the local level, we're not going to solve the problem, because working on adaptation on climate is not only about working at community level. We need to build infrastructure, the irrigation system, things that you cannot do at the community level. You need to work at subnational level, sequence and layer. And I think that is a hard reality that we need to come to terms.
Okay,
because
thank you so much.
we are going to finish in a situation like Sudan today, when we didn't engage with the Sudanese government after the coup because of the sanctions. So we need to mitigate those risks as well. Sorry.
Thank you. Dr. Zalan, I'll come to you in a second, but I just wanted to bring in very briefly Capucine Tibi. I hope you can hear us, maybe come off mute. So Capucine Tibi is the author of a report where she basically spoke to women and girls in Afghanistan about the impacts of environmental hazards. Capucine, could you just come in briefly about some of the findings of your report and how relevant they are to today's discussion? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for letting me briefly speak. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I work at Ground Truth Solution. We're an organization where we ensure that the perspective of people affected by climate or humanitarian crisis are heard by policymakers. And so that's in this context that we did this study in Afghanistan, where we spoke to 2,000 men and women. And so shortly, yeah, some key findings were that people really told us about the worsening impact of the climate crisis and how it makes their impossible situation a lot more worse. They spoke a lot about gender consequences of the climate crisis, notably child marriage, but also gender-based violence and the psychological impacts on men as they lose their ability to provide for their families, notably in drought-affected areas. What was very clear from the research is that people don't just want emergency response, they really want investments in climate resilient infrastructures and adaptive livelihoods. So things that can prevent climate hazard from turning into real disasters. And for that, they also really emphasize the need for early warnings and more awareness on how to better prepare when a climate hazard happens. I'll post the report link in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Capucine. And Dr. Zalan, just over to you for any final thoughts you have based on the discussions and examples that we had there from Somalia and Yemen.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will be quick on the local partners just to minimize the role of DFA. We have so many actors in Afghanistan which are potential to be used and utilize their expertise. We have women teachers still in private sector in schools and also in primary and secondary public schools. There are 70,000 women are busy in that, and more than that, like 100,000 women who lost their job, they can be used as local partners on community level to educate. Media is another structure which is still available and viable. We can use that. The tribal structures, shuras, locally, jirgas, they can be empowered and they can be used for local resilience. And finally, UNESCO, WHO, UNHCR, UNICEF, they still have local partners. IOM, still have local partners. We can utilize and use them. I think the pretext of not having partners locally should be avoided, because we have so many potential partners and we need the funding to minimize the impact of the climate changes. We are going through a very hard time in Afghanistan. And thanks to the Somalia case and also to Vasquez for the Yemen case, I think, and also to Dima and Charity and everybody who has contributed to this very important topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zalan. You've done my work for me, saying thanks to everyone there. But a big thanks to the audience. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of your brilliant questions. And for those of you who couldn't join us, this is recorded, so we'll be posting this soon. A huge thanks to Dima Redda, the author of our report. You can read that report on our website. Dr. Zalan, joining us from Kabul. Charity Watson from the UN. Mauricio Vasquez from ODI. A huge thanks to everyone at Berkhof who made this event happen. And have a great evening. Bye-bye.